My name's Deborah Jacobs. I'm the executive director of the Ernest Becker Foundation. I'm a volunteer. We do have Lila, who is a paid staff person, as well as some part-time help, but I'm a volunteer, and we have a board of about 5 to 7 people. We're just in transition. The Ernest Becker Foundation was founded in 1993 by Dr. Neil L.G., and in fact, we just lost Dr. L.G. He died in, I think, April. I guess he was 93, and he was really a light to our organization from the beginning to the end. And those of us who got to spend time with him as he was going through his end of life really saw a graceful way to view your own death. And I know he wouldn't want me to use anything but the actual words in expressing it, but Dr. LG, who was a physician, read Becker in his career and started spreading the word. And when he retired, he founded the EBF. And over the years, we sponsored events and supported research, developed content. We supported the film Flight from Death. We've been supporter of TMT research and other related science. And we try to really capture both the science and the humanities side of Becker's synthesis. And our primary purpose is around public education and new applications, but I would also mention that we in a way serve as a hub for people who are taken by this work. Many people, when they're introduced to Becker, it clicks for them. That was how it was for me, and it really becomes a passion. And so if you're interested in meeting more people with like interests in this work, then we're a great place to be engaged. One of our newest initiatives that we're working on now is trying to bring together cause-based advocates with TMT researchers to see whether there are, if I can use an outdated word, synergies around the information that activists or advocates need to advance their causes. And when you think about causes like police practices, police brutality, abortion rights, the death penalty, war, all those issues have such strong mortality salient elements, and sort of how do the people who want to make change overcome our reactions. So if that's something that's interesting to you, drop me or Lila a line, and we'd love to keep you apprised of it and see if there's a way we could get you involved. So that's a little bit about me and the EBF. I'm going to introduce our speakers next, and then we're going to get started with their intros. So ladies first, I'm going to introduce Lindsey Harvell-Bowman. She's an associate professor in the School of Communication Studies in the Department of Psychology at James Madison University, where she leads the Terror Management Lab, conducting research centered around terror management theory. Hi, Lindsey. Next, we have Sheldon Solomon, professor of psychology at Skidmore College. He, along with Jeff Greenberg at the University of Arizona and Tom Pyszczynski at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, are the co-creators of terror management theory. This theory explores the effects of the uniquely human awareness of death on individual and social behavior and has been supported by the National Science Foundation. He is co-author of The Worm at the Core, on the role of death in life. And most importantly, he was my favorite college professor. Class of 90, thank you. Finally, last but not least, we have Kenneth Vail, a social psychologist and professor at Cleveland State University, where he directs the Social Psychology and Existential Attitudes Research Laboratory, that's SPEAR. He is also the founder and president of an international society for the science of existential psychology. And Dr. Vail's research is focused on existential psychology, including the consequences of humans' awareness of their own mortality, autonomy, choice, freedom, and the influence of the existential concerns on cultural activity, personal growth, and both physical and mental health. So our format is we're going to ask a question of each of our speakers to get started and let them give a little bit of intro, and then we'll start fielding your questions, and we look forward to those. So going to open with Sheldon Solomon. And Sheldon, for those who might not be familiar with TMT, can you summarize it a little bit and talk about the ways in which TMT is playing out in real time with this pandemic?
Yeah, happy to, Deborah. In a nutshell, TMT, or what we call terror management theory, is just our effort to formulate Ernest Becker's ideas in a way that renders them amenable to producing hypotheses that can be subjected to empirical scrutiny. English translation, Becker wrote a lot of books, and they all surround one central notion, and that is that human beings are so smart that we realize that we're here, That realization, while generally uplifting, also brings the unwelcome recognition that, like all living things, we will someday die, that we can die at any time for reasons that we can never control, and that we're just ensconced inextricably in a physical carcass that will age and decay and ultimately die. And according to Becker, this gives rise to potentially debilitating existential terror that we as human beings manage by embracing what Becker called cultural worldviews, beliefs about reality that we share with our fellow humans that give us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And according to Becker, we are consequently motivated, whether we're aware of it or not, and mostly we're not, to maintain confidence in our culturally constructed beliefs, as well as faith in our value as human beings. And that a primary function of cultural worldviews and self-esteem, by no means not the only function, but a primary function, is to minimize death anxiety. Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, but couldn't get an academic job because his ideas were dismissed as fanciful speculation on the grounds that there was no empirical evidence for them. And so at first, Tom and Jeff and I and our students, and now a lot of talented youth, including Lindsey and Kenneth, and folks all over the world, have conducted experiments that have provided what we believe to be compelling, convergent evidence for the merits of these ideas. And so, for example, we have demonstrated that when people are reminded that they're going to die, that it makes them particularly hostile to other individuals who are different, either domestically or folks in other countries. So we see death anxiety as underpinning prejudice and ethnocentrism. Death anxiety increases our support for charismatic populist leaders. It makes us deny that we're animals and encourages us to be uncomfortable in nature and to piss on the environment, makes us greedy and insatiable consumers of money and stuff, and it magnifies all pre-existing psychological conditions. And there's a massive empirical literature that shows that this is what happens in the lab. Now we see this happening in life. One way of seeing the virus is that it is a rather pervasive reminder of mortality. And it shouldn't surprise us, therefore, that we're seeing increased hate crimes and ethnic tension, that we're seeing increased support in Europe and in the United States for populist leaders. We're seeing people hostile to the environment. They haven't stopped shopping, they haven't stopped eating, they haven't stopped drinking, and all levels of anxiety, depression, and psychological disorders are pretty much elevated. Now, there are some good things happening, and hopefully Lindsey and Kenneth will get us into those areas, but I would say for the moment that this is a pretty good, for better and worse, real-life depiction of terror management processes in motion.
Thank you so much, Sheldon. Ken, you've done a lot of research on both positive and negative responses to mortality awareness. With COVID, we see both the positive and the negative playing out. Can you talk about the conditions that determine when each is most likely to occur and explain how both positive and negative behaviors serve to help us cope with death anxiety?
Sure. When I think about this issue and how it might apply to the coronavirus pandemic, I tend to think about, what do we know already about how death awareness impacts the way that we think or apply versus not apply logic in the way that we address the concern and the consequences for that in terms of our social or existential motivations. And so we know that it has at least two distinct effects, or at least us quantitative psychological scientists have kind of oversimplified it into two distinct effects. It's probably really existing along a continuum, so there's a caveat that comes with that as we continue to discuss what I'm about to chat about. But we sort of think about things as an easy heuristic as if there being two distinct effects here. And so the first is that we know that when people are consciously thinking about and aware of mortality, and it's in their focal attention, then they can use their available psychological resources to do one of two things. either they can use logic and reasoning to try to like do problem solving about it, or they can use, you know, some mental gymnastics to just straight up deny their vulnerability. So if you were consciously thinking about the risk of mortality, you might try to logically solve that problem by taking steps to literally not die, right? You put your seatbelt on, you decide to quit smoking, you choose low-fat cream cheese, you schedule that appointment with your doctor for the physical, that sort of stuff. So now those are very logical approaches to actually reducing the risk of mortality. But if you're not able to take those kinds of steps to actually genuinely reduce the risk, then really the only thing that's left to do with those available logical abilities, if you want to beat the fear, is to try to convince yourself that you're just not vulnerable in the first place, right? So you might try to reassure yourself that even though maybe you don't have your seatbelt on in the car, maybe you reassure yourself that the road you're traveling on is pretty safe and you're not at risk. Or you tell yourself that the cigarettes that you just bought aren't that bad because they got a filter, or that you're not really a quote unquote smoker because you just enjoy a couple of sticks on the weekend with your friends over a few drinks. And so you're not really in that category, so you're not really at risk for lung cancer, that kind of stuff, right? Or you convince yourself that it's okay to eat that whole tub of ice cream or the whole, you know, the whole fat cream cheese or the whole olive plate or whatever because you went for a walk that morning. And so this is when you're using your available logical abilities to try to convince yourself that you're just simply not vulnerable. So now when it comes to the coronavirus, clearly it's a direct threat, right? And it makes us aware of the concept of mortality in a very conscious way. And so we try to do problem solving about it. I love that line from Tolkien's The Hobbit, where he remarks that it does not do to leave a live dragon out of your calculations if you live near him, right? And so it's like, well, no kidding, right? Taking steps to protect one's health is a pretty straightforward way to cope with the awareness of the risk of mortality. Quite literally, you know, staving off the cold hand of death. So yeah, you know, when the coronavirus rolled around and we started to really appreciate that this thing was a killer, we started to see hundreds of millions of people doing exactly this stuff, right? We started to listen to our public health officials. We started doing social distancing. We started using hand sanitizer. You know, we're wearing masks, we're donating N95s to the hospitals, we followed and obeyed the stay-at-home orders and so on and all the rest of it, all of which were attempts to logically address this very real threat of pandemic-based mortality. Now imagine though, that you're either occasionally or chronically in a situation where you might not be able to take those kinds of steps to actually genuinely reduce your risk. Maybe you start seeing warnings about this mysterious new virus, but maybe you either have a difficult time understanding or keeping up with the public health officials, or maybe you just don't have masks or hand sanitizers, or maybe you're not in a situation where you can do social distancing or obey stay-at-home orders, like maybe if you're an essential or a frontline worker. In those cases, right, you're mentally aware that there's this potential risk of mortality, but you're not really in a position to take steps to genuinely reduce that risk. So you really only have those two options here. Either you rock yourself back and forth, quivering in fear, or you try to use your available logical abilities to reassure yourself maybe that you're not really vulnerable in the first place. And indeed, we've been seeing both of those reactions happening. Right, we've been seeing frontline workers in hospitals and grocery stores repeatedly and loudly expressing their fear that they're in real and present danger, exactly because they don't have sufficient PPE and quite literally cannot take the sufficient steps to genuinely reduce the risk. And then on the other side of that coin, right, we see massive numbers of people, I think idiots, heading to the beaches during spring break and Memorial Day with no social distancing, not a mask to be seen. And, you know, when they're interviewed about that on site by, you know, probably flabbergasted news crews, those people simply explain that they don't think that they're at risk. because they've reasoned that they're young and healthy people and the virus primarily only affects the elderly and the sick, or it's because they're outside, or it's because the wind is blowing, or it's because the president himself doesn't wear a mask because he says that the whole thing is this fake news Democratic hoax and that we're really not at risk. So when people are consciously thinking about the risk of mortality, but there's a situation that they're in where they can't really do very much about it, we're seeing the people who have a front row seat to the death and despair experiencing and vocalizing their existential concern, whereas maybe the people who are a little further removed are simply convincing themselves that they're not vulnerable in the first place, right? So that's the first process. When people are consciously aware of and thinking about mortality, then they mostly either use that available logic and reasoning ability to try to solve the problem, or they do some of these more mind-boggling mental gymnastics to just straight up deny their vulnerability. Now, the second process, in this process, we also know that when people are not necessarily consciously thinking about mortality anymore, when it's no longer in their focal attention, then they no longer consciously wield that logical reasoning ability to try to problem solve that concept. Instead, what they do is they attempt to live up to the salient cultural standards and values, because doing so allows them to feel like they're a person of value in a seemingly permanent and enduring system of meaning, everything that Sheldon just mentioned. And so now here's where I think, though, a really important question to ask is, what are the salient cultural standards and values for any given person in any given moment? So for example, when our national identities are particularly salient, those, the non-conscious awareness of mortality, then those processes might motivate us to defend and affirm those nationalistic identities. And that might be in part why when the Trump administration characterizes the spread of the pandemic in nationalistic terms, doing things like blaming the Chinese, claiming the Americans are doing the best we can to defend ourselves against the quote unquote Chinese virus, that might be why during this existential threat of pandemic, we've been hearing reports about like heightened prejudice against Asians and Asian Americans. However, it's not all just purely negative and hostile motivations that come from this process. In research from our lab and many other labs, we've found that when other, perhaps more pro-social cultural standards and values are salient, such as the values of tolerance, compassion, empathy, and helping, and there's a number of others that have been studied, that when those are salient, then the non-conscious awareness of mortality can motivate us to instead defend and affirm those values, those aspects of our worldviews, and lead us to be more open-minded, or more accepting and welcoming and inclusive, or more peaceful, or more helpful, and so on, and the rest of it. And so this latter process, this more pro-social process, might be why we're also, and thankfully I think more often, hearing about these more heartwarming stories during the pandemic where people are being generally patient and helpful and compassionate toward each other, right? Not only in just how we treat our family members at home, but also neighbors and coworkers and people that we find outside as we go about our days. And then on that point, I think that one last little thing to throw in here is to think about how technology has helped to shrink the world, making it easier and quicker to travel and send information around the world. And that means that journalists in the foreign and domestic press have been able to bring together public health information from around the world and make sense of it in the broader context, and then deliver that to us basically in real time. And in the process, that then allows us to become aware of how interconnected we all are, and how the coronavirus pandemic is an existential concern that threatens really every one of us across cities and states and countries and continents. And that's important because it increases empathy and the awareness of experiences and values that go along with a sense of a common humanity. And based on some of our own research, we know that when people are focused on, for example, localized problems, like a local or regional flood, that emphasize local or regional or nationalistic like distinctions, Israeli versus Palestinian or American and Mexican and those kinds of things, that then the non-conscious awareness of mortality can have all of the typical effects of motivating people to defend and affirm their identities in hostile or perhaps even militaristic intergroup ways, right? But in contrast, we also know from that same research that when people are focused on widespread or even global natural disasters, like climate change is a big one that comes to mind, but we're also now having a double whammy with this pandemic. These sorts of things that emphasize broader social identities, right? That we're all in this together. Then the awareness of mortality instead motivates friendly intergroup cooperation and international peace building. So, the fact that many, if not all, of the coronavirus news stories, the fact that they emphasize that this is a global pandemic, which is of course an oxymoron, makes salient our broadest social identities, as a deeply interconnected humanity. And that may help to break down some of our typical intergroup dividing lines and bend the arc of our existential motivation in a more positive direction by making these pro-social values salient, by making us empathetic and aware of our interconnectedness. And that might then lead toward more peaceful, beneficial international cooperation as we recognize that we're all in this together. So those are some of the various kinds of positive and negative effects that the heightened awareness of mortality is going to be having on us due to the coronavirus.
Thank you so much, Ken. Appreciate that. Next to Lindsey. Lindsey, being an expert in both communications and psychology, can you talk a little bit more deeply about what role you think the media is playing in our ability to cope with death anxiety during the pandemic? Is it helping us, or is it exacerbating the problem, or maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I live in these two worlds every day, right? I live in communication and psychology, and I think both of them can really inform the interesting yet troubling state of our society that we are in right now. The 24-hour news cycle has definitely not helped society's psychological state lately, but this isn't really anything new. We've seen this in other situations. So for instance, one thing we have found in our research is that plane crash news coverage increases both flight anxiety and death anxiety. The media makes it worse, and we've seen it numerous times. The other example would be 9/11. The media coverage of the bodies jumping to their death from the Twin Towers are images that are permanently etched in our psyche for those of us that witnessed that live. In years from now, we won't forget the worldwide death count that is constantly shown on some networks and emphasized repeatedly by on-air reporters. To put it lightly, COVID-19 media research is definitely contributing to chronic death salience, as well as political polarization. Different networks are describing COVID-19 in ways that make you think you are viewing completely different events. So CNN is typically doom and gloom with a side of anti-Trump. MSNBC typically just all anti-Trump all the time. And while Fox News can be upbeat and hopeful, everything is framed around a pro-Trump frame. So when combined with coverage from press conferences from our president that often give conflicting information from one task force member to the other, it further invites polarization, panic, and finger pointing, something that I think we can all agree we've seen a whole lot of in the past 4 months. The bottom line is that we feel out of control. And when we feel that, some will go into more healthier pro-social behavior, such as making masks for people, being kinder, as Ken said. But some will go for more unhealthy antisocial behaviors, such as panic and every person for themselves, which we've definitely seen as well. The one thing that we know from terror management research is that if we ignore the material that is reminding us of death, it will immediately help us feel better. But how do you get away from this? You could turn off the news. I think that's probably the easiest thing to do. But then you're left with, you can't go anywhere. Why? Because you might die. If you live in places like Virginia, where I currently reside, it is now illegal to be in a public space without a mask. Why? Because you might cause someone else to die. You can't ignore it, and you can't get away from it. It's literally everywhere. Although I will say those on the far right have attempted to ignore this by claiming it's simply a media conspiracy. Cue the angry mobs from a few weeks ago in Denver when they got upset for not being being told to stay home. Control, or lack thereof, is really at the root of this problem. Look, I don't want to become an enemy of the media. The media is a double-edged sword. They can make us panic and feel out of control, and they do a great job doing that. But they can also provide us with information that can help us control the virus and our fear of impending doom. We know from the media's reporting that by engaging in certain behaviors, we can control the virus, and that naturally helps us feel better psychologically. Controlling our own death, and when it happens, is something that we have consistently seen lower death anxiety in our research with suicidal populations. By taking control, we also might be better suited to move toward more pro-social behaviors, which would be a good thing for all of us. We can control the virus by staying home, wearing a mask, and socially distancing. 3 very easy things we can do for ourselves and for others. A sense of control will naturally alleviate some of the panic that COVID-19 has caused, which will allow us to deal more directly with the more pressing issue, in my opinion, and definitely the one having more long-lasting implications on our behavior, society's chronic death salience. The problem is that we have groups of people that will not know that when there's a pandemic, the CDC is where we should go for information. In fact, they might not even know the CDC exists. And if they do, they may not have the resources to get that information. The main 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CS, they are the ones reaching those populations and letting them know this very important information. So while the media can ignite panic and fear, we do kind of need them. We need them to help disseminate this important information that could potentially save lives to all of Americans. Thanks.
Thank you, Lindsey, and thank you to all our presenters. We have a whole bunch of great questions, so I hope your brains are still fresh because these are good ones. First of all, there's quite a few questions that relate to the impact on the pandemic's death prime and the impact on the protest and police violence that we've been experiencing for the last 2 weeks, and sort of how it affects protesters, whether the pandemic might have had an impact on Officer Chauvin. So Sheldon, if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask you to start on this one and then have our other panelists add what you leave behind, but thoughts on the pandemic relation to our current protest and police violence uprisings.
Well, yeah, as a caricature of a stereotype, Lindsey and Kenneth will perhaps add some nuance. I would just say that it's a sad and predictable outcome in the sense that here we've got these pervasive reminders of death that we know from our research, stoke racial hostility, mainly white people, and racist hostility to Black people. On the other side of things, we know that white people threatened when their identity is threatened by intimations of mortality, that makes them more hostile. There's some evidence, as you know, both in your work and in some of our collaborative endeavors, that law enforcement personnel, when they are exposed to existential threats, that might increase the magnitude of their violent reactions. And so I just see threats of death everywhere. I see President Trump as being a caricature of a stereotype, of a prototype of someone who's extraordinarily afraid of death, and that his death anxiety is manifested in his malignant narcissism. But I see his reaction to these events being that of someone in a severe state of narcissistic rage in the service of death denial. Let me pass over to the other folks.
Lindsey, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would exactly say the same thing as Sheldon. I completely agree. Because I'm here primarily to talk about mortality, salience, and media, I will kind of take that angle and let Ken talk about the rest. I was discussing this earlier today, that how the media can often ignite more anger, right? The fact that we're seeing these happen in big cities, we're also seeing them happen in small cities. I have family in Wichita, Kansas, and friends, and that's not a place that you would expect protests and looting, but they certainly had that yesterday evening. And I think a lot of that has to do with these death reminders that the media is potentially making things worse in a way, and they're acting out on that.
And Ken, do you have anything you want to throw in on this one before we go to the next question?
Yeah, I would echo what's previously been said, and then also add that I mean, we know a few things about both cause and potential consequence of the process that are involved. And so if the question's about, you know, how do these two things intertwine with each other? How does the pandemic, and then also, you know, 400 years of systemic and institutionalized depression interact with that? You know, it's as Sheldon said, both tragic and predictable. You know, this sort of stuff wasn't a surprise that it happened, or that it will happen again, certainly. But we just happen to be in a situation now where everybody's existential hackles are up, so to speak. And we know from research that's been done both in the lab and behavioral research, that kind of stuff matters. And, you know, so when we're talking about implicit biases, or, you know, police reactions to various different groups that they might interact with when they're on the beat, there's been some research on that. Jeff Schimmel's done some stuff that's demonstrated that it activates stereotypic thinking. People rely on intuitive thoughts that just spring to mind quickly. And so if you happen to be a person who doesn't live under a rock and has maybe watched the news a time or two, or a Law and Order show or whatever, the types of associations that are taught to us and formed, you know, build particular connections between racial groups and thoughts of, you know, peacefulness, or, you know, politeness versus danger, and yeah, and that you should be you should take precautions with certain groups of folks. And so, you know, if we have an entire class of people in our society who are interacting with those various groups as our police forces do, under conditions where, you know, we're inundated with existential concerns during times of pandemic. I mean, that's the spark in the powder keg meeting right there, right? You know, so, you know, it makes sense that someone's intuitive associations about that might be pretty active when they meet somebody who's all they've done apparently was have a forged $20 bill. And you react to them as if they're a person that you need to be wary of.
Okay, we have like 100 great questions, and we have about 20 minutes left. So I want to ask our speakers to kind of do what you can. Here's one that I love. Will prolonged death anxiety create a culture shift in the United States with the pandemic? And that's from, hi, Melvin Mackey. Lindsay, do you have anything on that? Will prolonged death anxiety create a culture shift in the United States? Thoughts on that one, or do you want to pass?
If it does, I hope it shifts it to more pro-social behaviors and not the other way, right? Yeah, maybe. I mean, if it lasts maybe a long, I mean, I don't know. I think it will, it'll just be the new normal, right? Yeah. And I think if you think about things that used to, if you think from a media perspective, things that used to be really scandalous, for instance, when Lucy and Desi shared a bed on national TV, right? Totally crazy. Now you're seeing entire sex scenes on TV. And so you wonder if it'll be the same way, right? Yes, pandemic is making us terribly death salient. You know, we're watching the news, we're seeing groups of people attacked. That's making us into it's just an existential nightmare outside right now. But what makes us those aspects, and I think Sheldon and Ken will agree that, those will always ignite those behaviors, but I wonder if it would need to be stronger. If it was consistent over time, it would need to be stronger to ignite that. I'm curious to see what the others think.
Sheldon, anything on that one?
Well, I hope so. So I like Albert Camus at the last sentence of The Plague. He says, "We learn in times of pestilence that there's more to admire in mankind than to despise." And I certainly hope he's right, and that one benevolent outcome of just a sustained period of death anxiety is that we won't be able to confront it in a mature and effective fashion by resorting to the two kinds of defenses that Ken described. So terror management defenses are generally fleeting and ephemeral. They're really directed to get death off our minds. But one possibility is that pervasive anxiety may bring us to the point individually and collectively where we have to do another one of my favorite Camus quotes, come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible. There is good research suggesting that one of the best ways to buffer death anxiety is gratitude and humility. And it's something we could all, I think, be a little bit better at. And so I think that's the upside, is that persistent death anxiety might bring out our proverbial better angels. On the other hand, there's the real risk that it will put us all in a state of PTSD. And there's some alarming evidence that's coming from studies of healthcare professionals suggesting that this is not that this is a very real possibility. So that would be an unfortunate outcome, that we become even more like upright bipedal, respiring pincushions in a post-traumatic stupor. And then the other thing is it just could really bring out the worst in us. Just keep making us more hateful, warmongering, proto-fascist, plundering the planet in our insatiable quest for dollars and dross. And I sincerely hope that that's not the case, but I could see those as three different pathways. Ken?
Thank you. Next question is from Larry, and it's for all three of you, and it's for quickie answers, and it's, have you overcome your fear of death, and if so, how? Ken, do you mind starting?
Sure. Yeah, we talk about this frequently, I think, every time we gather at conferences. But yeah, I think the quickie answer is that we intellectualize it so that it becomes sterilized, and it's something that happens on paper when we write book chapters and journal articles and do lab studies. And so it winds up being this nerdy thing that we do until we venture out of our labs and encounter the real world.
Thanks, Lindsay. How about you?
Yeah, you think yes, but I agree with Ken. We just go meta, right? We just start. I mean, you know, when I go through a process of someone dying, I'm like, oh, cool, I did that, and I know why after the fact, right? So yeah, and it's definitely the sterilized thing that we write about. Because if we were contemplating our own death every day, we wouldn't be able to leave the house. So.
Sheldon, how about you on that one?
Yeah, ditto. Tom and Jeff and I have joked over the years that terror management theory has been our proximal defense to ward off death anxiety, that by reducing it to an academic exercise, we render ourselves momentarily immune from actually having to think about it. That's not a good thing. I found that for me, as I'm on the threshold of senility, that, yeah, what helps me in reality are my kids, Maureen, my spouse, my dogs, my friends, and really the relational aspects of the connections that I've forged with my colleagues. And I think that's just common sense masquerading as psychological insight, but that's what's best for me.
All right, thank you. This is a question that the person to answer it, his name is Dan Lichty, and he's not on our panel today, but I'm going to see if anyone else has something on it. Do you get your gold star for knowing Becker? What would Becker have thought about the Eastern meditative notion that there is no self? Anyone want to tackle that one?
No, Dan should tackle that one.
Okay, I'll tell you what, that one's from my friend Seppi, who I've been stalking for about 10 years. And Seppi, if you reach out to me, I will put you in touch with the person who will answer that for you. Okay, this one, a human rights educator who studies power, identity, and violence with Becker at the heart of investigation. A key concern of my work focuses on trauma, recovery, and resilience. Have your studies shown psychological triggers, activities, or influences that reverse negative responses to death anxiety in a healthy, conscious way? We get this question in one way or another a lot. How do we turn this into something usable, something something that we can kind of put to a greater good? Does anyone have a comment on that? Any relevant studies you can think of?
So some of our research that I've done with my colleague Ken Critchfield, also at James Madison, we've been working for several years with suicidal populations, trying to understand how they're getting around their own, how are they buffering their own death anxiety. And one thing that we have seen is that they are buffering. I totally lost my train of thought. Naturally, on a national webinar, I do that. They can you repeat? Just remind me just a couple words real quick.
He's an educator. Of course, I lost track too. An educator about how resilience, trauma, are there studies that show like how can we counteract death anxiety, basically?
We're thinking that igniting death anxiety in suicidal populations might actually get them out of that mindset momentarily. We've seen that when asking about a hypothetical situation where they might have a terminal illness like cancer. We would expect them to go ahead and end their life. That's what they were wanting prior, but it actually turned it around. They wanted to live out their life with their attachments, and that was something that we are still investigating with people. So that is not publishable data quite yet, but it's definitely something that we're trying to replicate and see if that might be a positive way that we could use both, death anxiety, mortality salience as a positive to help people with mental illness.
Either of our other panelists want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, real quickly, we've done a few studies that are interesting that I'll just mention in passing. One has to do, and I'll skip why this might be useful in terms of helping traumatized people. And whoever asked the question can write to me if she or he would like to. But we've done some fascinating work where asking people to imagine themselves flying. Flying is ubiquitous in all cultures. There's myths and cartoon characters, and it might be representative of symbolic immortality. So what we find, for example, is when people imagine themselves flying, that reduces psychological dissociation, which is increased in response to mortality salience. And dissociation is a known precursor of PTSD. Another thing that we're toying with that may sound odd is we've just done some work with folks who have had near-death experiences, and we have replicated a very common finding, which is that for most folks who have had them, there's rather permanent and positive transformational consequences. And so we're trying to figure out, as bizarre as this may sound, how we can phenomenologically create a near-death experience without having to nearly die. And we're hoping that that might have some clinical applications.
Thank you so much. Oops, yep, I'm still on. So here's another one. Due primarily to the lockdown, the unemployment rate has risen 10 points, which could translate into 400,000 deaths. How do we respond to the many people who are anxious to end social distancing? And by the way, that's from our friend Steve James in New York, who's a filmmaker, and check out his group, the Contemporary Heroism Initiative, online. So high unemployment rate could translate into deaths. I'm not totally sure I'm clear about that connection, but we know the question: how do we respond to the many people who are anxious to end social distancing because they cannot afford to stay home? Does anyone want to tackle that one?
Yeah, real quickly, what we could do is what every other developed country in the world has done, and that is to support people directly, which would reduce the unemployment rate by more than half. And so we're the only developed country that isn't providing direct support to every individual. Most European countries are giving 80% of every employed person's salary till the end of the pandemic. Germany has the highest unemployment rate at about 5%, as I understand it. I know that's not answering Steve's question directly, but I do think it's important, even though this is not a psychological point, it's a political one, and that is that these are the results of political decisions. They're by no means economic inevitabilities.
Ken, did you want to weigh in as well? You look like you might.
I was nodding in agreement. The only thing I would add to that is to build on the point and say that, you know, the skyrocketing unemployment and all of the other expenses that, you know, would stress that situation can be further resolved through other policies. I won't list them, but, you know, to say that those are political decisions rather than perhaps a psychological consideration.
Also, guaranteed income, which is originally a conservative idea. It's popping up on the left and the right. And I would propose, not on political grounds, but on economic grounds, that the best way to address this concern is to render everybody capable of basic sustenance, which, as I understand it, would also have positive impacts on the economy.
Okay, for this one, I'm going to pull a yes, no from every panelist. Will things go back to normal, or will there be permanent changes in people's attitudes in society due to COVID-19? From Mac, in Sweden, I think.
Wow. Hi, Mac in Sweden. I think it depends on what happens. Again, I can imagine some people behaving as if this has never happened 5 minutes after their gym and local coffee shop opens. I think other people have already been permanently altered in a rather radical fashion. I know that's not helpful, but that's a great question.
Anyone else on Mac's question? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, Sheldon, that was neither yes or no.
That's right. I tried to have it both ways.
But I'm also gonna dodge and say both as well, and say that there's, and I think that there's probably some sort of other individual difference that meaningfully, or maybe a whole constellation of them that meaningfully predict who falls in which category. But you know, I think Memorial Day, at least around here, and I'm sure other places, as the news feed that I was observing last weekend illustrated, Memorial Day illustrated that a bunch of people have already gone back. It's already over, back to normal. They've stopped doing all of this stuff. Whereas for other folks, they are still living with it, and it's still a scary time, and they are still at risk, and they're very aware of it, and they're doing all of the things, and so this will not be normal. And then, of course, there's the institutional concerns. So, universities won't be letting people back to doing what they need to do. Hospitals will have different regulations. Governments will have X, Y, or Z to say about it. But as to whether it's a day-to-day concern for you, I think it probably matters a whole lot of different background characteristics.
Lindsey, do you want to add as well on that one?
Yeah, I'm cynical about society, so I'm gonna say we're gonna go right back to where things were eventually, because yeah, I'm cynical. I'm not gonna say yes and no.
Okay, the next question is going to be the last question, and someone urged us to go over time. I so appreciate that. I live by the theory of leaving you wanting more, but that comment does encourage us to do other webinars. And also someone said, why isn't Dan Lichty on the panel? Well, we will definitely be happy to have Dan Lichty speak on a panel on another topic in the future, so keep that in mind. But the last question is one I love from Brandon. What have you found to be a compelling illusion that does not lie about life, death, and reality during this current pandemic that can help you stay grounded? This is what we all need help with. Have you found a compelling illusion that does not lie about life, death, and reality during this current pandemic that can help you stay grounded as individual, smart human beings?
No, but I'm working on it. I have the apocalypse fruit grove in my backyard. I started planting fruit trees because I think food's going to be useful in the years to come. I'm very comforted by the Walt Disney-like array of wildlife that is now prancing around our house and neighborhood. I've never seen like deer walking down our street or rabbits the size of raccoons like I am now. And this gives me great faith by reminding me that humans are, we're important and we're cool, but we're a rather incidental and transitory entity, and like all living things will ultimately expire, hopefully not for a while and hopefully not due to our own efforts. But the fact that, as corny as it sounds, that life goes on, and despite all of this, it's been a beautiful and verdant spring. That's my illusion, that's a harbinger of good things to come.
Thank you. Kenneth, how about you? What's your comforting illusion that's not a lie?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but
how do you find peace without lying to yourself in these hard times?
I see. Well, I'm big into I've organized kind of a lot of what I do around two overarching values, and that's education and compassion. And so I've been heartened in many ways over the past couple months to see those two things happening in some very consequential ways. We've not turned to some of our traditional leaders in this crisis. We've turned to the scientifically literate. That's I think encouraging. And we've not just let the reins off. It's not science without compassion. It's science with compassion. And so, it's people taking care of each other with the benefit of knowledge and careful learning. And to me, that speaks for a brighter future. And I've also, like Sheldon, been applying that on the micro level, and we just put our garden in last week with some technology and all the fancy things. And so we've been seeing that translate there as well. So. I find that heartening, and lots of cool things on that.
Great. And to you, Lindsey?
I'm envious of these gardens. We have bears, so I can't have gardens. But it's a nice thought. No, I do a lot of exercise. I am a pound pro, so I have these drumsticks, and it's not ever a lie. I mean, sometimes I feel like dying when I'm doing it, but I pound my sticks so I don't pound faces, and so it's great. It's great anger management, and it keeps me sane during a pandemic. And and it might be a little bit of death denial because it keeps my heart pumping. So
thank you. Finally, I just want to share the answer that EBF's own Lila Rothschild sent, which is music.
Oh, nice.
Very nice, yeah. So if you enjoyed this webinar, please consider making a donation to the Ernest Becker Foundation. We operate on a shoestring. As I mentioned, I'm a volunteer. We could really use your support to get our content out. We also would love involvement. If you're someone who would like, we're actually at a moment of change because of our founder dying, as I mentioned, and we are getting new board members and new energy, and we would love to have you involved. And then just last thing, at a minimum, please sign up for our periodic e-newsletters on our website. I want to thank you all. We will have this recording posted and we'll let you know when that's available. We'll schedule others because I think my impression has just been successful. I'm so sorry to those of you who sent questions that we could not get to. Some of them monographs that we could not get to, but we'll get to them next time, and we love your involvement and your interest. So everybody hang in there during these hard times and know that there are like-minded people around you, and thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.